buy a lot of things for $10. A bruised sandwich, a cheap pair of socks, 2 hours of warmth in a 24-hour diner. June bought a building, or more accurately, a rotting wooden grave for 1,000 dead clocks, and what she found inside changed everything. The municipal building smelled of wet wool, industrial floor wax, and the quiet despair of people who owed the city money. June sat in the back row. She hadn't come to buy anything. She had come because the heavy cast-iron radiators in the back of the room hissed with beautiful, free heat, and the security guards usually gave you 2 hours before asking to see a bidding paddle. She was 20 years old. Her boots were lined with folded newspapers to block the holes in the soles. Her jacket was a men's large, stiff with dirt, drowning her thin frame. Being homeless wasn't the romanticized, tragic adventure movies made it out to be. It was mostly just boring. It was waiting for a soup kitchen to open, waiting for the rain to stop, waiting for the invisible clock to tick down to the moment a cop tapped his nightstick against the bench and told her to move along. At the front of the room, a bored city clerk named Harrison droned through the foreclosure docket. He was auctioning off seized properties, burned out husks in the industrial district, condemned row houses. Most went to men in cheap suits who bought them in bulk, intending to bulldoze the lots for parking garages. Lot 412, Harrison muttered, rubbing his eyes. A commercial sliver, 150 square feet, wedged between the alleyway on 9th and the old laundry on Pike, seized for back taxes in '98. City condemned the structural facade in 2000. No water, no power, he sighed, leaning into the microphone. The city just wants it off the liability ledger. Opening bid is $10. Silence hung in the room. The men in suits didn't even look up from their phones. 150 square feet wasn't enough to park a truck. It was a glorified closet. June felt a strange, sudden tightening in her chest. $10. She reached into her deep left pocket. Her fingers brushed past a stolen packet of crackers, a plastic spoon, and found the tight, warm roll of her net worth. She pulled it out under the cover of her oversized sleeve. 7 crumpled singles. A heavy handful of quarters, dimes, and sticky pennies she had scavenged from fountain grates and bus stops over the last 2 weeks. She counted it by touch. $14.30. If she spent $10, she wouldn't eat anything hot for a week. But it had a door. A door meant a lock. A lock meant she wouldn't have to sleep with one eye open, listening for the heavy footsteps of men who hunted in the dark. A lock meant she could take off her boots without fear of them being stolen by morning. "Do I have $10? Harrison asked, raising his gavel. He sounded like he was begging. He just wanted to go to lunch. "Anyone? $10 for the deed." June stood up. The folding chairs squeaked violently in the quiet room. Every head turned. The men in suits stared. The security guard by the door paused, his hand dropping to his belt. June ignored them. She walked down the center aisle, her boots leaving faint, wet outlines of snow on the linoleum. She reached the clerk's desk and began unrolling the bills, flattening them with a dirty thumb. She stacked the quarters in 2 small towers. $10, she said. Her voice cracked. She hadn't spoken aloud to anyone in 3 days. Harrison stared at the pile of change, then up at her bruised, wind-chapped face. He didn't mock her. He just slowly nodded, stamped a heavy manila folder, and pushed a rusted ring of keys across the laminate desk. "It's yours, kid," Harrison said softly. "God help you." The address was on the edge of the garment district, a part of the city where the shadows always seemed to lean inward. It took June an hour to walk there. When she finally found Lot 412, her heart sank. It was a nightmare of rotting wood and shattered glass, squeezed like an afterthought between 2 towering brick buildings. The shop was a narrow wedge covered in decades of grime. The front window was surprisingly intact, but completely opaque with dust. Faded gold lettering peeled from the glass. H. Rossi, horologist. June grabbed the heavy brass padlock holding the front door shut. She fumbled with the rusted keys. Her hands were shaking. The cold was biting through her jacket, settling deep into her bones. She jammed the largest key into the lock and twisted. It didn't move. She gritted her teeth, wrapped her jacket sleeve around her hand for leverage, and shoved. With a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet alley, the lock gave way. June pushed the door open. The hinges screamed. A wall of stagnant air hit her. It smelled of old machine oil, dry rot, mouse droppings, and time. She stepped inside and pushed the door shut behind her, plunging the narrow room into dim, murky shadows. The only light bled through the filthy front window. It was a graveyard. Clocks were everywhere. Wall clocks with heavy oak cases hung at crooked angles. Grandfather clocks stood like silent sentinels in the back, their wooden bodies scarred and peeling. The floor was a minefield of gears, springs, shattered glass, and pocket watches swimming in jars of congealed brown liquid. It was an absolute mess. June leaned against the locked door and slid down to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She let out a long, ragged breath. It was filthy. It was freezing. There were probably rats. But as she closed her eyes, listening to the absolute, utter silence of the room, she smiled. She was indoors. Survival stripped away the luxury of feeling overwhelmed. The first 3 days in the shop were an exercise in brutal physical labor. June found a heavy wool overcoat draped over a broken chair in the back room. It smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and severely of mothballs. She used it as a blanket, making a nest under a heavy oak workbench where the drafts couldn't reach her. Hunger was a constant, sharp companion. Her remaining $4 bought a jar of cheap peanut butter and a loaf of bread, but that wouldn't last. She needed money. She started scavenging her own property. On the 4th day, she gathered a heavy canvas sack full of solid brass pendulums, broken copper winding keys, and unidentifiable metal housing plates. She dragged it 12 blocks to a scrapyard. The man behind the cage weighed it, eyed her suspiciously, and pushed $9 under the glass. June bought 2 cans of soup, a box of matches, and a cheap flashlight. With the flashlight, she could finally explore the back of the shop. The deeper she went, the more she realized that H. Rossi hadn't just been a clockmaker. He had been an obsessive hoarder. Behind the front counter was a narrow workspace utterly choked with debris. Drawers spilled over with tiny silver gears the size of a pinhead. Vices, files, jeweler's loupes, and bottles of dried-out solvent covered every flat surface. She began cleaning, not because she cared about the shop, but because she needed space to exist. She swept the floorboards with a broken broom. She organized the tools into neat rows. She threw out the garbage and the long-dead carcasses of pigeons that had found their way down the chimney. By her 2nd week, a strange routine had settled in. In the mornings, she scrapped useless metal. In the afternoons, she sat at the workbench. It started as sheer boredom. She picked up a small, broken alarm clock and a tiny screwdriver. She had never fixed anything in her life. When things broke in June's world, they stayed broken. But here, surrounded by the guts of machines designed to measure the one thing she felt she was wasting, she felt a sudden urge to understand them. She took the clock apart. She laid the gears out in a line. She saw how the main spring coiled tightly inside its brass barrel, how the teeth of one wheel caught the pinions of the next, transferring power, bleeding energy out in precise measured ticks. It was deeply logical. It made sense. The world outside the door, the cold, the cruelty, the men who stepped over her on the sidewalk made no sense. But this was just math and metal. She cleaned the gunk out of the gear teeth with a needle. She oiled the pivot points with a drop of motor oil she found in a rusted can. She put it back together. She wound the key. Tick, tick, tick. June stared at it, her heart thumping a strange, triumphant rhythm in her chest. She had brought it back. She started obsessively tinkering. She didn't know the proper names for the escapement or the balance wheel, but her hands figured out their purpose. She fixed a mantel clock. Then a cuckoo clock. She lost herself in the magnification of the jeweler's loop, the world shrinking down to a beautiful, manageable stage of brass and steel. It was late February, during a sleet storm that battered the front window like handfuls of gravel. When she found it, she was clearing out the bottom drawer of a massive locked steel cabinet in the back room. She had finally managed to pick the primitive warded lock with a bent paper clip and a pair of tweezers. Most of the drawers held nothing but rusted springs and molding ledgers, but the bottom drawer held a wooden box wrapped tightly in oilcloth. June pulled it out. It was heavy, much heavier than it should have been. She carried it to the workbench, turned on her flashlight, and peeled back the stiff, sticky cloth. Inside was a carriage clock. It was brutally ugly. Unlike the ornate, elegant French and German clocks that littered the shop, this one was a solid, matte, black iron box. It had no decorative engravings, no glass panels on the sides to show off the movement. Just a simple, stark, white enamel dial with Roman numerals. She picked it up. It weighed easily 20 pounds. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice rough. She turned it around. The back panel was secured by 4 heavy flathead screws. They were tightened down hard, the slots slightly stripped, as if someone had sealed it in a hurry and never wanted it opened again. June grabbed her largest screwdriver. She leaned her weight into it, grunting as she twisted. The first screw gave with a harsh, metallic screech. She fought the other 3 for 20 minutes, her hands cramping, knuckles white. Finally, the iron back plate dropped away onto the workbench with a heavy thud. June leaned in, adjusting her loop. The movement inside was massive, taking up almost the entire iron casing. But it was wrong. June knew enough by now to recognize the architecture of a clock. There should be a gear train leading up to the escapement. Instead, the center of the clock was entirely dominated by the spring case. Normally, a spring case, the barrel that held the coiled ribbon of steel powering the clock, was a small brass drum, maybe 2 inches across. The one sitting inside this black iron box was monstrous. It was a cylinder of solid, polished steel, 5 inches in diameter, bolted directly into the frame. It looked less like a clock part and more like a pipe bomb. She reached out and touched it. The steel was freezing. It didn't make sense. A mainspring that large would have enough torque to snap the delicate gear train to pieces. And looking closely, June realized there was no gear train connected to it. Oh, the rest of the clock was a dummy. The dial, the hands, they were glued in place. The entire iron box was just a heavily armored shell designed to hold this single, massive steel cylinder. June's breath hitched. She grabbed her flashlight and angled the beam directly onto the surface of the cylinder. There was a seam, a hair-thin line running around the circumference. It wasn't a solid block, it was a container. At the top of the cylinder, where a winding arbor should be, there was a strange, recessed keyhole. It was intricate, a star-shaped starburst pattern that no normal clock key would ever fit. June sat back. The sleet hammered against the glass outside, but the shop felt terrifyingly quiet. She looked around the workbench, her eyes scanning the hundreds of loose keys she had collected in a coffee can. None of them looked like a starburst. She spent the next 3 hours tearing the shop apart. She emptied drawers onto the floor. She checked the pockets of the moldy coats. She ran her fingers along the dusty lintels above the door. Nothing. Defeated, exhausted, and shivering, she sat back down at the bench. She stared at the iron box. "You didn't hide the key," June muttered to the ghost of H. Rossi. "If you built a vault this good, you wouldn't leave the key lying around in a drawer. You'd hide it in plain sight." She grabbed her flashlight and walked back into the main shop. She swept the beam over the hundreds of dead clocks staring back at her. Her eyes darted from face to face. Think. Her eyes caught the faint glimmer of gold lettering on the front window. H. Rossi, horologist. She turned back to the wall of clocks. Right in the center, hanging above the register, was a massive, cheap-looking wall clock. She had ignored it because it was modern, made of cheap veneer and plastic. It didn't belong with the antiques. It was an anomaly. She dragged a wooden crate over, stood on it, and reached for the cheap wall clock. She pulled it off its nail. It was light. She flipped it over. Taped to the back of the plastic battery compartment was a small, heavy object wrapped in electrical tape. June ripped the tape away. A heavy, dark metal key with a complex, star-shaped bit fell into her palm. Her stomach did a slow, nervous flip. She stepped down from the crate, her legs feeling like water. She walked back to the workbench, the key heavy and cold in her hand. She slotted the starburst key into the recessed hole on top of the massive steel cylinder. It slid in perfectly, flush with the metal. June gripped the key. She took a deep breath, braced her other hand against the iron frame, and turned. There was a heavy, wet click, followed by the hiss of depressurizing air. The front of the steel cylinder popped open, sliding forward on hidden ball bearings to reveal the hollow cavity inside. June shined the flashlight into the dark space. What she saw sitting inside made her drop the flashlight. It hit the floorboards, the beam rolling wildly across the room, illuminating her pale, shocked face. She backed away from the workbench, her hands covering her mouth, realizing instantly that her $10 sanctuary had just become the most dangerous place in the city. Harper stared at the spinning gears, her breath caught in her throat. The mechanism was no larger than a grapefruit, yet it moved with a silent, eerie fluidity. No mainspring, no battery, no pendulum, just a mesmerizing dance of pure gold, catching the anemic beam of her flashlight. She leaned closer. A faint hiss of air met her ear. It wasn't magic. It was a vacuum. A masterfully engineered aneroid capsule, expanding and contracting with the minute shifts in the room's temperature and atmospheric pressure, an endless engine. She reached past the ticking marvel and pulled the 3 copper cylinders from the velvet. They were heavy, sealed with thick crimson wax that had hardened into stone over the decades. Harper found a rusted letter opener on the floor and chipped away at the nearest seal. The wax fractured. She twisted the cap. It popped off with a sigh of stale air. Inside lay a roll of vellum paper. Harper unrolled it carefully, terrified the brittle material would disintegrate. It didn't. The ink was dark, precise, and unfaded. It was a schematic. Intricate drawings of the golden mechanism mapped out every gear ratio and pressure valve. At the bottom right corner, a neat cursive signature read, Josiah Winston, 1912. She opened the second cylinder. More blueprints, these detailing the lead-painted shell she had just destroyed. Winston hadn't built a clock. He had built a vault. He had hidden his masterpiece inside a monstrous, ugly decoy. The third cylinder held a leather-bound journal. Harper flipped it open. The handwriting was erratic, the ink smudged by sweat or tears. Winston wrote of a commission. A wealthy industrialist had demanded a timepiece that would never stop, a monument to human engineering. Winston delivered, but the industrialist refused to pay the agreed sum, threatening to ruin Winston's reputation if he withheld the clock. So, Winston hid it. He locked the prototype inside the iron spring case of a worthless factory clock and bolted it to the load-bearing wall of his shop. He planned to wait the industrialist out. The last entry was dated October 1918, the Spanish flu. Winston never came back. Harper sat back on her heels. The cold of the shop was entirely forgotten, as in she looked at her filthy hands, the grease beneath her fingernails, the blisters from the wrench. She was holding a lost piece of mechanical history, a literal gold mine. But she was still a homeless 20-year-old girl with a condemned building and $12. If she walked into a pawn shop with a solid gold, century-old perpetual motion clock, they wouldn't offer her an appraisal. They would call the police. She needed leverage. She needed legitimacy. Morning light began to bleed through the warped plywood. Harper packed the golden clock, the cylinders, and the journal into her dirty canvas backpack. She wrapped the clock in her sleeping bag for padding. She stood up, her shoulder throbbing violently from the iron plate's impact, and walked out the front door. She didn't go to the scrap yard. She walked 5 miles into the city center, past the soup kitchens and the bus stops she knew intimately, toward the financial district. She found a public library. She needed the internet. For 3 hours, Harper researched antique horology. She bypassed the retail jewelers and the local repair shops. She needed an academic, a historian, someone who cared more about the provenance than the melt value of the gold. She found a name, Dr. Harrison Cole, the curator of the National Museum of Timepieces. His office was in a restored brownstone 2 states away, but he had an emergency appraisal email listed on the museum's faculty page. Harper used a public terminal to type out a message. She didn't beg. She didn't sound desperate. She wrote with the cold, clinical precision of an owner. She attached 3 grainy photos taken with her cheap, prepaid phone, the gold mechanism, the signature on the schematic, and the date in the journal. She hit send. Then, she waited. The library closed at 6. Harper walked back to the freezing shop in the dark. She was hungry, her stomach a hollow cavern of aches. But she felt a strange, vibrating energy in her chest. When she turned onto Pine Street, her heart dropped. A bright yellow excavator was parked on the curb directly in front of her shop. A heavy chain was wrapped around the front axle of her 1998 station wagon, dragging it onto a flatbed tow truck. Maddox stood on the sidewalk, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, talking to a man in a hard hat. Harper broke into a run. "Hey!" she screamed, her voice cracking in the frigid air. "Put that down, that's my car!" Maddox turned, a smug smile stretching across his face. "Ah, the $10 squatter. Right on time. You missed the notice, kid." What notice?" Harper demanded, stepping between him and the tow truck driver. "The emergency condemnation order," Maddox said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his tailored coat. "The city inspector came by this afternoon. You left the front door unlocked." He saw the compromised load-bearing wall. "Deemed the structure an imminent collapse hazard. The demolition starts tomorrow at dawn." Harper felt the blood drain from her face. The wall! She had cracked the brickwork, pulling the massive iron spring case down. Maddox had called in a favor to fast-track the demolition. He was going to bulldoze the shop and claim the land. "You can't do this," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I have 90 days. You had 90 days to fix it," Maddox corrected, sipping his coffee. "You broke it further. The city is seizing the property to clear the hazard. I've already submitted my bid for the empty lot. You should have taken the $500. He turned his back on her. Harper stood in the freezing street, watching her car, her only shelter for the last 8 months, disappear around the corner. She touched the heavy canvas backpack slung over her shoulder. She had the clock. But she was losing the war. Harper didn't sleep that night. She sat on the floor of the back room, wrapped in her coat, the golden clock ticking silently in her lap. The rhythmic expansion and contraction of the brass aneroid capsule was the only movement in the dark. At 5 a.m., her cheap phone buzzed. The screen lit up the gloom. It was an email from Dr. Harrison Cole. Subject, Winston, 1912, prototype. Message, where are you? Do not touch the mechanism. Do not wind it. I am boarding a flight. Send me an address. Harper stared at the screen. A sudden, sharp breath escaped her lips. She typed out the address of the shop and hit send. By 6:30 a.m., the rumble of heavy diesel engines shook the rotting floorboards. Harper stood up, grabbed her backpack, and walked to the front of the shop. She unbolted the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The excavator was idling. Maddox was there, wearing a pristine white hard hat, holding a clipboard. Only a pair of city police officers stood nearby, their breath pluming in the cold air, holding cups of coffee. "Time to go, kid," Maddox said, checking his watch. "Unless you want to be buried under 50 tons of brick." "I'm not leaving," Harper said. She planted her boots on the cracked concrete. Maddox sighed in exasperation. He gestured to the cops. "Officers, she's trespassing on a condemned site. Escort her out." One of the officers, a burly man with a thick mustache, stepped forward. "Come on, miss. You can't be here. It's not safe." "I own this building," Harper said, her voice steady. "And the demolition order is invalid. There is a pending historical preservation injunction." Maddox laughed loudly. "A what?" "You're delusional. Start the machine," he yelled to the excavator operator. The massive metal bucket raised into the air, casting a long, terrifying shadow over the crumbling brick facade. Harper's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't flinch. She gripped the straps of her backpack. A black town car swerved violently around the corner of Pine Street, its tires squealing against the frozen asphalt. It slammed to a halt directly behind the excavator, blocking its path. The back door flew open. A man in his 60s wearing a tweed jacket and round tortoiseshell glasses scrambled out. He looked panicked, his eyes darting from the excavator to the crumbling building. "Stop," he shouted, waving a leather briefcase in the air. "Turn that machine off." Maddox frowned, stepping forward. "Who the hell are you? Get your car out of the active demolition zone." "I am Dr. Harrison Cole, curator of the National Museum of Timepieces." The man snapped, ignoring Maddox completely. He zeroed in on Harper. He took in her dirty clothes, her pale face, and the heavy canvas backpack she was clutching. "Harper?" "Yes," she said. Cole stepped past the police officers. "Do you have it?" Harper unzipped the backpack. She pulled away the folds of her sleeping bag and lifted the golden mechanism into the morning light. The street went dead silent. The early sun caught the flawless gold gears, illuminating the intricate etchings. The mechanism ticked, a silent, impossible heartbeat powered entirely by the cold morning air. Cole dropped his briefcase. It hit the pavement with a heavy thud. He fell to his knees on the freezing concrete, his hands hovering inches from the gold, terrified to touch it. "My God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's real. The Winston Perpetual. It actually exists." Maddox marched over, his face flushed with anger. "What is going on here? That's scrap metal. Get out of the way, old man." Cole looked up at Maddox with an expression of absolute disgust. "Scrap metal? You ignorant fool. This is the holy grail of early 20th century horology. It is a working atmospheric perpetual motion prototype. It belongs in the Smithsonian." Cole stood up, turning to Harper. His hands were shaking. "But, Harper, the museum has a discretionary acquisition fund. I am authorized to offer you $2.5 million today, wired to your account by noon." Maddox stopped dead. The clipboard slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the sidewalk. The police officers stared, their mouths slightly open. Harper looked at Maddox. She looked at the heavy excavator bucket poised to crush her home. Then she looked at the golden clock in her hands. $2.5 million, Harper repeated. Her voice was perfectly calm. "That works." "Wait," Maddox stammered, stepping forward. His eyes were wide, frantic. "That was found in a condemned building. The city owns the contents." "I own the deed," Harper cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip. "I bought it at auction for $10. The contents are mine." She turned to the police officers. "Gentlemen, this man is trying to illegally demolish a building containing historical artifacts. I want him and his machinery off my property." The burly officer looked from the solid gold clock to Maddox. He put his hand on his radio. "All right, Maddox, back it up. Shut the machine down." Maddox opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer, crushing reality of his defeat silenced him. He looked at Harper, really looked at her, and saw the absolute, unyielding steel in her eyes. He turned and walked away, his expensive boots heavy on the pavement. Harper watched the tow truck lower the excavator back down. She felt Dr. Cole gently touch her arm. "We need to get this to a secure vault," Cole said softly. and we need to get you a hot meal." Harper looked back at the ruined facade of Winston's Horology. The building was broken, freezing, and filled with dust. But it was hers. "Thank you, Doctor," she thought, a genuine, exhausted smile finally breaking across her face. First, she needed to pay a contractor to fix her wall. Harper didn't sell the building. 2 years later, the brickwork was restored, the roof was replaced, and the neon sign above the door glowed a warm, steady amber in the night. She lived in the loft upstairs. The ground floor wasn't a shop anymore. It was a private gallery, open by appointment only. She sat behind the heavy oak counter, drinking a cup of premium, expensive coffee, listening to the gentle, synchronized ticking of 100 restored clocks. She had traded her $10 for time, and time had given her absolutely everything. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in pirate coves. They're hidden behind the dust of forgotten struggles. Harper took a $10 gamble and found a masterpiece that rewrote her entire future. What's the biggest risk you've ever taken? Drop your story in the comments below. If this journey of survival and clockwork discovery kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe for more incredible hidden history stories.